Welcome to Netflix and Will, where I, Will Webb, look at 3 major Netflix releases that came out this month. Today we're covering The King, Earthquake Bird, and The Irishman. First up, The King.
A king has no friends. Only followers and foe.
From director David Michôd, co-written with star Joel Edgerton, The King is a loose adaptation of Shakespeare's history plays regarding Henry V. In the lead role as Henry, or really starting off as tearaway drunk Hal, is Timothee Chalamet, heading up a cast including Edgerton as Falstaff, Ben Mendelsohn, the excellent Sean Harris, and Robert Pattinson with one of the funniest accents of all time. David Michôd's had a good career and all of his past movies are really interesting, you should check them out, but the clear star here is Timothee Chalamet. He shines in this lead role, really leaning on that kind of beautiful aquiline profile that he has to show Hal as this kind of aloof, self-possessed, brooding young man. That gives Edgerton plenty of opportunities for comic relief, and he kind of plays Falstaff as this more grounded figure in relation to Hal's brooding intensity, you know, that kind of dark energy that he gives off throughout the film, which means he's basically a foil to that character. Sean Harris, as ever, is really good value for money here, intensely creepy, and a really interesting character as quite an interesting arc over the course of the movie. The all-round good performances are aided by excellent craft. It's a really good-looking movie. The cinematography is all smoky and shady. There's lots of ghosting and lens flares in the movie that give it this kind of organic feel with every frame. The production design is also really good. Everything in the film feels lived in, believably, in a way that I think a lot of period films, medieval movies, tend to find it hard to get right. They either do too much of it and everything looks really like unbelievably mucky, or they don't do enough with it and it looks kind of like Disneyland, if you know what I mean, like a Renaissance fair or something. It helps that they took advantage of a lot of location filming in the UK, so all of these places really are places that were built around the time that's being portrayed. All of that adds up to some amazing battle sequences where Michôd is kind of taking advantage of that production design and the scope that Netflix money gives you to show these massive battle sequences, but he never gets distracted from the interpersonal conflicts that are at play. He's quite happy to show everyone lining up for a fight and then a little bit of the action before he kind of zeroes in on just an argument between 2 lead characters, because it's all about that interpersonal conflict, this movie. Now that might make the film frustrating for some viewers. You know, if you're expecting a bigger action movie, then I think you might be disappointed by the amount of talking in this film. But when it's there, the swordplay is excellent. It's been really cleverly choreographed so that it looks like it's actually happening. It's not just like a ballet or something. It's much more like a bar brawl than it is like something that Errol Flynn would have done. And then there's the scale and the scope of the project overall. They're not adapting just one Shakespearean play, but several at once, which seems like kind of a mad idea, but they do generally manage to make a coherent story out of it, albeit one that feels a little bit rushed and compressed at times. I know that sometimes throughout the screening I was sitting there thinking, I kind of wish I'd seen that thing they were talking about instead of them just telling me what happened. But unfortunately they just don't have the runtime to fill in 3 plays worth of events. The other downside of that is that some good actors get kind of lost in the sprawling storyline. In particular, I think that Lily Rose Depp is quite underused in it. I was surprised by how good she is, but she's barely in the movie. And also a newcomer called Tom Glyn Carney, who plays Hotspur in this film. He's a really interesting new actor who's only done a very few projects, but is kind of coming up very quickly now, and he's really underutilized. He's a very intense actor, and unfortunately he's not in the movie enough to really capitalize on that. So that's The King. It's slightly less than the sum of its parts, but for anyone who's a fan of Chalamet, Pattinson, Edgerton, Sean Harris, or if you just like that kind of Shakespearean setting, maybe even if you're a fan of medieval stuff but you don't want it all to be like kind of Games of Thronesy sex and violence, then this is a good film for you. Next up is Earthquake Bird, which, to sum it up, is kind of the other way that a less than the sum of its parts review can break.
Where were you the night Lily Bridges disappeared?
Earthquake Bird follows Alicia Vikander, playing a woman working in Japan as a translator. She falls into a strange relationship with a mysterious photographer, Naoki Kobayashi, which is further strained by a developing relationship between him and her roommate, Riley Keough. This is all told in flashbacks from an interrogation room, because Riley ends up missing, presumed dead. This film has loads of talent behind the camera. It's directed by Wash Westmoreland, who made Still Alice and a number of other good movies. It's shot by Chung Hoon Chung, who is best known as working with Park Chan-wook on films like Oldboy and The Handmaiden and is currently shooting Edgar Wright's new movie. The movie also, I think, couldn't possibly want a better lead than Alicia Vikander, who is this English-speaking, Japanese-learning, Swedish ballet dancer turned actress, who is just an astonishing talent that I don't think mainstream English language film has really taken advantage of yet. It's a shame with all of that talent behind the camera and in front of it that the movie just doesn't really work. None of those elements kind of come together. And I don't mean that they're in disagreement. I think, for instance, the DOP and the director are a good match for each other. The film's very good looking. There's just something missing about the film, and it's almost a mystery as to what exactly that is. There's something compelling about the story, and the actors are doing their best with the script, but it moves excruciatingly slowly, and the result of that is that we often feel like we're waiting for the characters to catch up to where the viewer is. That's of course the opposite of what you want from a thriller, where it should feel like events are out of the viewer's understanding, just at the edge of their grasp. The exceptions to that are these kind of bizarre events that seem to come out of nowhere, like for instance a side character just suddenly dies in an accident that involves one of the main characters, and it doesn't really seem to be in the film for any reason other than to illuminate something about Alicia Vikander, but that seems like a really cheap way to do that. There are a number of things like that that are often more character motivated as well, and when I see stuff like that in a movie where a character does something and I don't understand why they possibly thought that was a good thing to do, or I don't understand kind of the link between the last thing they did and this, that's when I feel like the movie's having an issue with the way it's written its characters, because it feels like the characters are doing things just because the plot demands it, as opposed to because it's something that I think that person would do in that situation. And there's a fair amount of that in this film. So weird decisions like that are kind of abound in the story, and it's not helped by the fact that the film is, by its nature, already focusing on quite a weird group of characters. Vikander plays her character as closed in, still, quiet, almost to the point of being unreadable in the film, and that makes her sudden outbursts of expression and emotion much more inexplicable. It's hard to understand where they come from in that character who is so closed in. Kobayashi is good as this smouldering boyfriend, but there's very little that we know about him, and so it's very hard to get excited about scenes he's in because it's hard to see the tension, if that makes any sense. I don't know what he's bringing in terms of his experiences as a character to the events that are taking place, and so he really remains a mystery almost for the entirety of the film's runtime, which is a bit of a problem. It feels like you never quite get proper motivation, and it's hard for you to get to grips with what's actually going on. To be honest, the film was a bit of a slog to watch, and I wouldn't recommend it, really. Which is a shame, because I would love to have recommended to you that you watch this film that's like half in Japanese, directed by a British director who works in America, got a Korean DOP, has this Swedish English, you know. There's a lot to like in the film's setup, and yet none of it comes together, which is really frustrating. Okay, so those two out of the way, let's talk about what you probably clicked on this video for, which is The Irishman. It's Martin Scorsese's biggest, longest movie to date, and it's on Netflix now.
It's over. They're all gone. Frank, it's time. It's time you say what happened.
The Irishman is the story of Frank Sheeran, a truck driver who gets involved in the Philadelphia crime families in the 1950s and slowly rises to become a mob hitman. Frank's placed for a job with Jimmy Hoffa, famous head of the Teamsters Union, and befriends him. And if you know anything about Jimmy Hoffa, you'll have a sense of where that's going. A lot of the interest in this film has come not just from the amazing cast, with Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci and Al Pacino all sharing significant screen time together, but from the extensive use of aging and de-aging technology that runs throughout the film. I mean, you've got a movie where De Niro portrays a character from his 20s to his 70s. Like, it's an astonishing use of technology in a much more interesting movie than where you often see that stuff, like the Marvel films, for instance. The real question is, of course, does it work? You know, is it more Benjamin Button or mustacheless Superman? Where does it stand on that sliding scale of CGI uncanny valley? The answer is it mostly works. It helps that De Niro isn't playing a 20-year-old for very long in the film. For most of the movie, he's only playing a character who's 20 years younger than he is now, rather than 40 years younger. And that makes a big difference. One of the big problems that's not immediately apparent, but is kind of subconsciously there throughout simple things like body language, is that, of course, De Niro's face is de-aged, so he looks like a younger man, but he is still physically in the body of an older man, and so he holds himself differently, which is a bit of a problem when he's doing stuff like roughing people up. There's one scene where he does it, where it just looks wrong. It just doesn't make any sense, like, to the viewer. Happily, there's not much like that, and it's not anywhere near as distracting as I thought it would be. Actually, much worse is that they made the decision to make Robert De Niro's eyes blue throughout the film, this really piercing crystal blue shade. And I don't know why they did that. I suppose just so he looked more Irish, which is kind of stupid, because that really does pull you out of scenes. It's very, very obviously fake, and it's kind of makes him look more uncanny than I think just the de-aging would. As for the movie itself, it's very long. Now, that's not a problem inherently. I feel like a movie can be about as long as it needs to be, and this is telling an expansive, epic story. But watching the film, I felt like it could definitely be half an hour shorter, and if I'm being honest, probably an hour shorter, without losing any of the story or themes. All you'd really lose is these kind of character patter moments. But if we're talking about the runtime overall, I think Scorsese, by and large, handles it quite well. He tells this kind of epic story that follows Sheeran as a sort of Gump-like figure throughout the vicissitudes of history. It's a $10 word, that's a good one. De Niro, Pacino, and Pesci are great, which I'm sure isn't surprising. In particular, Pesci is really good in the film. He's playing slightly against type here as a quite quiet and sort of almost frail guy. He's quite weedy, and yet he's this extremely important mob figure. He handles that with a sort of quiet dignity that I think is probably going to make him a shoo-in for the Best Actor nomination, and maybe the actual award itself at the Oscars. Al Pacino's bravado and slightly misplaced dignity as Hoffa fits the role perfectly well, and De Niro is sort of interesting in the film. He has this like deep quietness, like he's just watching events, he's observing, and you have that sense throughout the movie. He often talks about feeling kind of like he's just on a track. He says he's following orders like a soldier. So I guess he plays it like that, like this perplexed soldier who came back from the Second World War and was just looking for another cause to be a part of, which ended up being a bad one. Kind of following on from that, you can tell that there's a sort of nihilism, a finality to the film. No one really gets what they want, even when they win. The clearest example of this is that we're often introduced to characters with a sort of freeze frame and a title on screen telling us what their name is, when they died, and how they died, often in a really grisly way. It's this interesting device that reminds us of how kind of useless these lives are, that for all of their power, these people ultimately die alone and afraid once the tides turn against them. It's a pretty potent skewering of mob movie characterizations of power, which have been kind of well codified over the years, not least by Marty himself. Still, it's a gangster movie, and I've been honest about it on the channel before. I'm not really a fan of them, and this one didn't win me over. There's no real great human truths in it. I don't feel like I'm going to sit and think about the movie for a while afterwards. And if the film was 90 minutes, that wouldn't be a problem, but for me, having spent 3.5 hours of my life watching it, I kind of wanted slightly more from it. It feels a little bit flat sometimes in that. Maybe that's the point with its themes about nihilism. Maybe it's just that Marty got, you can make a film as long as you want because it's on Netflix, and he kind of ran with it. I'm not sure, I wasn't in the editing room. But although the pacing's kind of draggy, the effects can be distracting, and I'm not sure exactly what value you'll pull from it, probably more than me if you like gangster movies. I really don't, so that's obviously a bias I have. I think The Irishman is a really good movie. I think it's a good example of filmmaking that will really speak to the audiences that like Marty's work already. And, you know, as long as it is, you can always watch it in 3 parts because it's on Netflix, so why not? Why not watch it on your phone as Martin intended it, huh? All jokes aside, it is a good movie from one of cinema's greats, so I highly recommend you take the time to watch it. That's it for this edition of Netflix and Will, but I will see you at the end of December to talk about that crop of movies. Have a good one. Bye for now.